Secondly, if it was their sin to seek and set up such an one before he was tyrant, who yet was admitted upon covenant terms, and the manner of it registered, then much more is it a sin to seek and set up one after he declared himself a tyrant, and to admit him without any terms at all, or for any to consent or give their suffrage to such a deed. But the former is true, therefore the latter, and consequently to give our consent to the erection of the Duke of York, by owning his authority, was our sin. Thirdly, if it be a sin to own the manner of the king there described, then it is a sin to own the pretended authority, which is the exact transumpent of it. But it is a sin to own the manner of the king there described, or else it would never have been used as a dissuasive from seeking such a king. Fourthly, to bring ourselves under such a burden which the Lord will not remove, and involve ourselves under such a misery wherein the Lord will not hear us, is certainly a sin. Verse 18. But to own or choose such a king, whose manner is there described, would bring ourselves under such a burden and misery wherein the Lord would not hear us. Therefore it were our sin. Fourthly, we may add the necessary qualifications of magistrates which the Lord requires to be in all, both superior and inferior, and thence it may be inferred that such pretended rulers, who neither have nor can have these qualifications, and are not to be owned as ministers, who have no qualifications for such a function. We find their essentially necessary qualifications particularly described. Jethro's counsel was God's counsel and command, that rulers must be able men, such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness, Exodus 18, verse 21. Tyrants and usurpers have none, nor can have any of these qualifications, except that they may have ability of force, which is not here meant, but that they be morally able for the discharge of their duty. Surely they cannot fear God, nor be men of truth, for then they would not be tyrants. It is God's direction that the man to be advanced and assumed to rule must be a man in whom is the Spirit. Numbers 27, verse 18, as is said of Joshua. What spirit this was, Deuteronomy 34, verse 9, explains he was full of the spirit of wisdom, that is, the spirit of government, not the spirit of infernal Jesuitical policy, which tyrants may have. But they cannot have the true regal spirit, but such a spirit as Saul had when he turned tyrant, an evil spirit from the Lord. Moses saith they must be wise men and understanding, and known among the tribes, Deuteronomy 1, verse 13. For if they be children or fools, they are plagues and punishments, Isaiah 3, verses 2, 3, and 4, etc., not magistrates who are always blessings. And they must be known, men of integrity, not known to be knaves or fools, as all tyrants are always. The law of the king is, Deuteronomy 17:15. He must be one of the Lord's choosing. Can tyrants and usurpers be such? No, they are set up, but not by him, Hosea 8, verse 4. He must be a brother and not a stranger, that is, of the same nation and of the same religion. For though infidelity does not make void a magistrate's authority, yet both by the law of God and man he ought not to be chosen, who is an enemy to religion and liberty. Now it were almost treason to call the tyrant a brother, and I am sure it is no reason, for he disdains it, being absolute above all. That good king's testament confirms this. The God of Israel said, the Rock of Israel spake, he that ruleth over men must be just, ruling in the fear of God, 2 Samuel 23, verse 3. But tyrants and usurpers cannot be just, for they should render every one their right. They would keep none to themselves, but behooved to resign their robberies in the first place, and then also they must give the law its course, and that against themselves. These scriptures indeed do not prove that all magistrates are in all their administrations so qualified, nor that none ought to be owned, but such as are so qualified in all respects. But as they demonstrate what they ought to be, for so they prove that they cannot be magistrates of God, ordaining, who have none of these qualifications, but tyrants and usurpers have none of these qualifications. Much more do they prove that they cannot be owned to be magistrates who are not capable of any of these qualifications. But usurpers are not capable of any of these qualifications. At least they conclude, insofar as they are not qualified, they ought not to be owned, but disowned. But tyrants and usurpers are not so qualified in anything. Therefore in anything they are not to be owned, but disowned. For in nothing they are so qualified as the Lord prescribes. Secondly, I shall offer some reasons from Scripture assertions. First, it is strongly asserted in Elihu's speech to Job that he that hateth right should not govern, where he is charging Job with blasphemy and accusing God of injustice, of which he vindicates the Almighty in asserting his sovereignty and absolute dominion, which is inconsistent with injustice, and shows both that if he be sovereign he cannot be unjust, and if he be unjust he could not be forgiven, which were horrid blasphemy to deny. And in the demonstration of this, he gives one maxim and a question, which is equivalent to an universal negative. Job 34, verse 17 and 18. Should even he that hateth right govern? And wilt thou condemn him that is most just? Is it fit to say to a king, Thou art wicked, and to princes, Ye are ungodly? In which words the scope makes it clear that if Job made God a hater of right, he should then deny his government, and if he took upon him to condemn him of injustice, he should blasphemously deny him to be king of the world. For it is not fit to say to any king that he is wicked, or so ungodly as to be a hater of right. For that were treason, lese majesty, and in effect a denying him to be king. Much less is it fit to say to him that is king of kings. Here then it is affirmed and supposed to hold good of all governors, that he that hateth right should not govern nor bind, as it is in the margin. For habash signifies both to bind and to govern, but all to one sense. For governors only can bind subjects authoritatively with the bonds of laws and punishments. I know the following words are alleged to favor the uncontrollableness and absoluteness of princes, that it is not fit to say to them, They are wicked. But plain it is, the words do import treason against lawful kings, whom to call haters of right, or to call their kingship in question, as the scope shows, in that these words are adduced to justify the sovereignty of God by his justice, and to confute any indirect charging him with injustice, because that would derogate from his kingly glory, it being impossible he could be king and unjust too. So in some analogy, though every act of injustice do not unking a prince, yet to call him wicked, that is habitually just, and a hater of justice, were as much to say he is no king, which were intolerable treason against lawful kings. But this is no treason against tyrants, for truth and law can be no treason. Now this is the language of truth and law, that wicked kings are wicked, and they that are wicked and ungodly ought to be called so, as Samuel called Saul and Elijah, Ahab, etc. However, it will hold to be a true maxim, whether we express it by way of negation or interrogation. Shall even he that hateth right govern? But are not tyrants and usurpers haters of right? Shall therefore they govern? I think it must be answered, they should not govern. If then they should not govern, I infer they should not be owned as governors. For if it be their sin to govern, right or wrong, it is all one case, for they should not govern at all, then it is our sin to own them in their government. For it is always a sin to own a man in his sinning. The royal prophet, or whoever was the penman of that appeal for justice against tyranny, Psalm 94, verse 20, does tacitly assert the same truth in that expostulation. Shall the throne of iniquity have fellowship with thee, that frameth mischief by a law? Which is as much as if he had said, The throne of iniquity shall not, no, cannot have fellowship with God. That is, it cannot be the throne of God that he hath any interest in, or concern with by way of approbation. He hath nothing to do with it, except it be to suffer it a while, till he take vengeance on it in the end. And shall we have fellowship with that throne that God hath no fellowship with, and that is not his throne but the devil's? As it must be, if God doth not own it. Much may be argued from hence, but in a word, a throne which is not of God, nor ordained of God, but rather of the devil, cannot be owned. For that is the reason of our subjection to any power, because it is of God and ordained of God, Romans 13, verse 1. And that is the great dignity of magistracy, that its throne is the throne of God, 1 Chronicles 29, verse 23. But a throne of tyranny and usurpation is a throne which is not of God, nor ordained of God, but rather of the devil. Ergo, the minor is proved. A throne of iniquity, etc., is a throne which is not of God, nor ordained of God, but rather of the devil. But a throne of tyranny and usurpation is a throne of iniquity. Ergo, it is not of God, and so not to be owned. Thirdly, the Lord charges it upon Israel as a transgression of his covenant and trespass against his law, that they had set up kings and not by him, and had made princes, and he knew it not, Hosea 8, verse 4, and then taxes them with idolatry, which ordinarily is the consequent of it, as we have reason to fear will be in our case. He shows there the apostasy of that people in changing both the ordinances of the magistracy and of the ministry, both of the kingdom and of the priesthood, in which too the safety of that people was founded. So they overturned all the order of God, and openly declared that they would not be governed by the hand of God, as Calvin upon the place expounds it. Whereas the Lord had commanded, if they would set up kings, they should set none up but whom he choosed. Deuteronomy 17, verse 15. Yet they had no regard to this, nor consulted him in their admission of kings, but set them up, and never let him to wit of it, without his knowledge, that is, without consulting him, and without his approbation, for it can have no other sense. I know it is alleged by several interpreters that here is meant the tribe's secession from the house of David, and their setting up Jeroboam. I shall confess that the 10 tribes did sin in that erection of Jeroboam, without respect to the counsel or command of God, without waiting on the vocation of God as to the times and manner, and without covenanting with him for security for their religion and liberty, but that their secession from David's line, which by no precept or promise of God they were restricted to, but only conditionally, if his children should walk in the ways of God, or that their erecting of Jeroboam was materially their sin, I must deny, and assert that if Jeroboam had not turned tyrant and apostate from God, for which they should have rejected him afterwards, and returned to the good kings of David's line, he would have been as lawful a king as any in Judah, for he got the kingdom from the Lord the same way, and upon the same terms that David did, as may be seen expressly in 1 Kings 11, verse 38. It must be therefore meant either generally of all tyrants, whom they would set up without the Lord's mind, as at first they would have kings on any terms, though they should prove tyrants, as we have seen in Saul's case, or particularly Omri, whom they set up, but not by the Lord, 1 Kings 16, verse 16, and Ahab his son, and Shallum, Menahem, Pekah, etc., who were all set up by blood and treachery, the same way that our Popish duke is now set up, but not by the Lord, that is, by his approbation. Hence I argue, those kings that are not owned of God, nor set up by him, must not be owned by us. For we can own none for kings but those that reign by him, Proverbs 8, verse 15, and are ordained of him, Romans 13, verse 1. But tyrants and usurpers are not owned of God as kings, nor are set up by him. Ergo, again, if it be a sin to set up kings, and not by God, then it is a sin to own them when set up. For that is a partaking of, and continuing in the sin of that erection, and hath as much affinity with it, as resetting hath with theft. For if they be the thieves, they are the resetters who receive them and own them. Fourthly, the prophet Habakkuk, in his complaint to God of the Chaldean tyranny, asserts that God hath made righteous, as the fishes of the sea, as the creeping things, that have no ruler over them. Habakkuk 1, verse 14. Now how were they said to be without a ruler, when the Chaldean actually commanded and absolutely ruled over them? Yea, how can the fishes and reptiles have no ruler over them? If domineering be ruling, they want not that. When the weaker are overmastered by the stronger, and by them made either to be subject or to become their prey. But the meaning is, these creatures have no ruler over them by order of nature, and the Jews had then no ruler over them by order of law or ordination from God, or any that was properly their magistrate by divine institution or human orderly constitution. We see then it is one thing for a people to have an arbitrary or enthralling tyranny, another to have true magistracy or authority to be owned over them, without which kingdoms are but as mountains of prey and seas of confusion. Hence I argue, if the Jews, having the Chaldean monarch tyrannizing over them, had really no ruler over them, then is a tyrant and usurper not to be owned for a ruler. But the former is true, therefore also the latter. Fifthly, our Savior Christ delivers this as